All right, we are going to get started here. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Osterville Village Library. My name is Amy Wolf. I'm the programming director here at the OVL. Thank you all for joining us for today's fascinating program, Churchill's Secret Armies in World War II, presented by historian David Barrett. During the Second World War, Britain faced one of the greatest threats in its history, and under the leadership of Winston Churchill, extraordinary measures were taken to prepare for the possibility of invasion and occupation. Hidden networks, resistance groups, covert operations, and secret plans all became part of a little-known chapter of wartime history that continues to intrigue historians and audiences alike. This afternoon, David Barrett will take us behind the scenes of these clandestine efforts, shedding light on the brave individuals and secret organizations that operated in the shadows during one of the world's darkest times. His engaging presentations and deep knowledge of history always bring the past vividly to life, and we are delighted to have him with us today. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to historian David Barrett.
Thank you, Amy. That was very nice of you. And welcome. I look forward to this one. I've done this in a few libraries, but I've never seen such a wonderful setup as you have here in Oxford. So that's good. I'll be careful I don't step over that.
I did hide it with the table.
I know, you're quite right. So, first of all, let me give you a little bit of information about myself. I was born in April 1939. So, World War II, as you know, started, thank you, in September 1939. So I grew up really amid the destruction that was taking place from the bombing, both day and night. I must have felt by the end of the war that this is quite normal. My father was recruited straight away into the army, and my mother and I lived in a small apartment in the center of the city. Now, I'm going to give out a map of Europe. Can you? Here we are. It's really a map of Europe as it was in 1939. It'll help remind you of the various countries that we'll get into and start discussing during this presentation. The first session today will be explaining how Britain developed its intelligence services and how the Special Operations Executive came into being during World War II. Is there enough copies there? Just well done.
Your wife did not get one.
The second session tomorrow, which, by the way, I believe starts at 1, not 2. We'll look at various intelligence operations that took place during World War II and how it assisted the victory of the Allies in 1945. So, what I'd like to explain first is the formation of the British intelligence agencies. But one thing I'd like to say right up front, if you have any questions, please ask them straight away. Don't wait to the end. Put your hand up and we'll stop and we'll try to answer them. Also, there is a list, there's about half a dozen different books that I brought in on this particular service. Now, although intelligence collection was obviously used during Elizabethan times, it wasn't really until 1873 that an intelligence branch of the British Army was actually formed. Shortly after, the Navy got involved and the Admiralty formed their own intelligence service called the NID. Doesn't take much to realize that meant Naval Intelligence Department. In 1909, the Secret Service Bureau was formed, which brought together both intelligence departments together. And during World War I, the counter-espionage section became what was called the Directorate of Military Intelligence, Section 5, MI5. That's where that comes from. And the foreign section was MI6. So today, MI5 is known as the Security Service and MI6 as the Secret Intelligence Service, the SIS. Now, previous to this, in 1938, Hugh Sinclair, the chief of SIS, moved the agency Government Code and Cipher School really from St. James's Park, where it was initially set up. And obviously that's in the middle of London. Not a great place to have a cipher school. They moved it to Bletchley Park. And that's 30 miles north of London. Some of you may have been there. The nearest town is a town called Milton Keynes. And it's worth a visit. Next time you're in London, 30 miles out, Bletchley Park, because Bletchley Park now is a museum, and it's where Alan Turing and his code breakers broke the German ciphers in World War II. So it's worth a visit. It's fascinating. Any questions so far? Great. Now, early in his career, Churchill enthusiastically supported efforts to improve the British intelligence gathering. And this started in 1916 with the Easter Uprising in Ireland. Now, a truce was signed at that point between the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, and the British government in June 1921. Now, Churchill, who by this time was in charge of the Colonial Office, and he took the lead in steering this truce through the House of Commons. Now, the Sinn Féin delegation arrived for talks at 10 Downing Street in October 1921 with the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. Naturally, Churchill was on hand at that point, being in charge of the Colonial Office. Over the next 12 months, Churchill established a relationship with Collins, and the two men soon had a rapport. Collins became Prime Minister of the Provisional Irish Free State, and Churchill, as the Colonial Secretary, was responsible for relations with Dublin. Well, we seem to have lost the slide. Sorry? Probably would help. Yes, it shows a donkey animal at the moment. You're okay here, but I think we have a small problem here. Although,
Can you explain a little more about
sure.
Ireland at that time and its relation with England?
Well, Ireland didn't want to be part of the UK. So the Irish Republican Army had already become in charge of what was taking place in Ireland. However, the problem there was that there was a lot of violence going on, and the British government didn't want to lose Ireland at that time. So Michael Collins, who was the gentleman in charge of the intelligence for the IRA, was the person who took over and finally became Prime Minister. Yes.
Do you think his rapport with Churchill was another reason why he was assassinated, because he was so friendly with the Brits?
It could well be. It could well be. I'll just get my backup notes on this, because the computer that I use is a Mac. This is not a Mac. So, fortunately, I have some notes here. Okay, here we are. Something's gone wrong.
Gone wrong.
Well, Donkey Day, it says.
We don't need that.
Thank you. That's it.
All right, and I just make sure
Yeah,
that's clicking. All right, we should be good.
thank you. Let's go back to that.
All righty.
There we go. Thank you. You see how easy it is when you know what to do. There we are. Coming back to Michael Collins. He had a very nasty attack on his life at this point, and he narrowly escaped with that because the Republicans who had taken over the law courts disliked him. Churchill, however, because of the relationship with Collins, managed to get more arms to be sent to Collins, who then put down that little revolution. And in fact, the law courts were soon recaptured. Now, unfortunately, 6 weeks later, Collins was killed in a Republican ambush in County Cork. So, unfortunately, the man was killed. Churchill's dealings, though, with Collins deepened his respect for intelligence and how you can sneak behind the ruling groups and how it undermines the strength of an occupying force. Another individual who was involved in Ireland was Major Colin Gubbins of the Royal Artillery. He was the officer in charge in Ireland at the time who actually handed over those guns to Collins on Churchill's orders. Gubbins had 2 years earlier experienced fighting in Russia with the anti-Bolshevik forces in Murmansk. The experience in both Russia and Ireland gave Gubbins invaluable experience in subversive war. And in 1938, he drafted a handbook on guerrilla warfare for all personnel involved in subversion. Now let's take a look at what's taking place in Europe in the late 1940s. 30s. It works. There's Germany in blue there. Adolf Hitler announced he wanted to recombine all of the German-speaking peoples in Europe. This is where your map will help. And he made that announcement in 1937. And then the next year, he marches in to Austria in purple here, and also into the little yellow area or green area around here called the Sudetenland, and it's part of Czechoslovakia. Now, to be fair, both Austria and Sudetenland were German-speaking, and they'd been part of the German Empire way back. Now, in doing this, he broke all the rules of the Treaty of Versailles. And that, unfortunately, nobody seemed to take any notice of. Other areas he took over were places like Schleswig-Holstein, Eupen-Malmedy, and also Alsace-Lorraine. So this was already breaking the Treaty of Versailles that had been signed at the end of World War I. Everybody clear on that? The same year, Germany also had re-entered this area of Germany, which is called the Rhineland, the Ruhr, with his own troops. Up to that time, French troops, Belgian troops had been there again with the Treaty of Versailles. That was the arrangement. But of course, that area is where all the manufacturing of weapons takes place in Germany, the Ruhr. Well, previous to these events, Chamberlain had met several times with Hitler to try and discuss diplomatically how a solution could be reached to establish peace. And in September 1938, Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister, came back from a meeting with Hitler with a piece of paper, as you can see, he's holding above his head. It's signed by Chamberlain and Herr Hitler, saying, "Peace in our time." Unfortunately, this appeasement came to nothing a year later, because then Poland was invaded. As many of you are aware, World War II started in Britain in September 1939. And Germany invaded Poland here. And the British government under Neville Chamberlain declared war on Germany, breaking a rule. Now, there was a secret agreement also going on at the same time between Hitler and Stalin. And the idea was that when Germany invaded Poland, Russia would do the same thing from the other end. And they did. And they essentially carved up Poland between them. There was an arrangement between von Ribbentrop and the Russian government to that event. Any questions? Yes, love.
Why? Why did they do it?
Because both, first of all, Hitler wanted to expand eastward. He wanted more land, Liebestraum, he called it. He wanted more land in the east. Russia felt that they owned Poland. And between the two of them, there was a deal struck. The poor Poles were just mortified, as you can imagine. So Britain had to prepare for war. Conscription starts and Parliament passes the Emergency Powers Act. And it was at this time that Winston Churchill was brought into the War Cabinet. He came in as First Sea Lord of the Admiralty. That's how he came in to the War Cabinet. Now, it was obvious that a serious European conflict was about to start, and preparations like evacuations, rationing, all sorts of movement were causing disruptions within Britain. However, the first 6 months of the war was relatively quiet. And in fact, it wasn't until April 1940, 7 months after war had started, Germany invades Denmark and Norway. Well, Britain sent troops to help the Norwegians, but they were eventually, all of those troops were evacuated. And Norway and Denmark were now occupied by Hitler's army. So why did he invade Denmark and Norway? Well, Denmark was actually a stepping stone to Norway. Norway was where German ships would come up to Narvik all year round and pick up iron ore from Sweden across the border and exported round this way to Germany. They couldn't export during the winter on the Baltic side because it was icebound. That was the difference. So obviously Hitler knew he needed iron ore, and he needed it coming constantly. Any questions? Yes, sir.
When Chamberlain came home with that paper in Austria, didn't that start a flame between and Churchill's relationship?
Sorry.
Didn't it break he and Churchill's relationship a little bit? I mean, I
After he invaded, there was a lot of criticism of the government when that happened. But don't forget, appeasement was the name of the game. And the last thing that people really wanted to do was to have a repeat of World War I. Well, following the defeat in Norway, Prime Minister Chamberlain finally resigned. Now, he was a sick man at this point. He was actually suffering from a cancer. But he resigned, and he asked whether Winston Churchill or Lord Halifax would take over the job of Prime Minister. Well, Lord Halifax said no, he did not want the job. Part of that was because Lord Halifax was in the House of Lords, not in the House of Commons. That was the big difference. Churchill turned around and said, absolutely, I'll take the job. Now, he made a lot of changes to the War Cabinet in Britain at that time. He knew that at this stage, Britain couldn't defeat Germany alone, and that it needed the support and help from America to accomplish this goal. And at this time, I'm sorry, America was isolationist. They didn't want to get involved, understandably. This was May 1940, and Britain had already sent a expeditionary force of about 200,000 men and equipment to France because that looked like the next step. So, well, as anticipated, the Germans invaded both Belgium and Holland straight from Germany. They swept in and they swept over those countries in about a week. That's all it took. The buildup of troops from Germany started in the Ardennes area around here, because Germany knew that if they tried to invade France straight from Germany, there was the Maginot Line that had been constructed over the last 10 years. And to try and go through the Maginot Line, which was a defensive line that France had built, would have been very, very difficult. However, to come through the weakest part of the Maginot Line was actually this area here, the Ardennes forest. The French and the British troops all fell back, and eventually, at the end of May 1940, they were evacuated from Dunkirk. There's Dunkirk up here. There's Dunkirk. They evacuated the troops from Dunkirk without any equipment. All they had were the guns they could carry. This evacuation took place between May 26th and June the 3rd, and a total of 350,000 British, French, and Belgian troops were rescued from the German onslaught. Well, once that happened, the French government resigned, and Marshal Pétain became president of the unoccupied zone of France, known as Vichy France. Okay? Well, Britain now knew they were next in line for an invasion. Yes, ma'am.
What was you think? Why did Germany occupy all of it? Why was there an occupied and unoccupied area?
Well, there were a couple of reasons. One was there was a strong movement in France, particularly in the Vichy area, of agreeing with the German expansion. They didn't have a problem with that.
The Vichy.
The Vichy, yeah. There were already resistance groups in France building up. And that, of course, with the number of troops that Germany had, it wasn't sufficient to cover all of France. You'll see in a couple of slides how it's divided up between Vichy and occupied. Okay, any other questions? So Britain now knew they were next in line. And that, of course, started with the attack from the Luftwaffe in July 1940. And the idea was that the air invasion would destroy the RAF, the Royal Air Force, and it would then enable the Germans to have a seaborne invasion, which was called Operation Sea Lion. The Battle of Britain was a hard-fought campaign, and the Germans really tried to destroy the RAF. They bombed the airfields. But in fact, those airfields were not normal runways like you see today. These were grass. So when you bomb a grass runway, it's not too difficult to fill in the hole and off you go again. So the RAF, however, were extremely brave in fighting off the Luftwaffe. But the Luftwaffe changed its tactics in September 1940, and they started bombing London instead of the RAF airfields. Well, now, it was during this time, back in Britain, that there was many years to come that the British Army were going to actually conduct a successful campaign on foreign soil against the German army. At the same time, Britain was not going to surrender. So it had to investigate ways in which it would hamper the German war effort. Well, the British Secret Service in November 1939 had been penetrated by the German intelligence departments. That was a... So the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, knew this, and he decided to start his own spy and sabotage agency. So, out of the debris of 1940, with defeat staring Britain in the face, Churchill seized on the long familiar weapons of Secret Service to try and fashion the intelligence community that helped so significantly to deliver victory in Europe. It was in July 1940 that this new secret organization was established, and it was called the Special Operations Executive, SOE. Now, what you've got to remember here is that none of this was known until 1989, because the British Secret Act had not been disclosed to anybody. Everybody was told, do not say a word. If you break this, you'll go to jail. So nobody knew about this until 1989. And that's when many of those books started to come out. And that, of course, was the Special Operations Executive. What he used was a number of people from MI5, some from MI6, and it was known as the Inter-Services Research Bureau. And the idea was to try and coordinate subversion and sabotage against the enemy overseas. It was led initially by Hugh Dalton, the Minister of Economic Warfare, and also the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but very secret. And Churchill issued an instruction to Dalton to set Europe ablaze. Well, even though it was known officially as the Inter-Services Research Bureau, the people who worked at SOE called it Baker Street. That was it, because that's where it was located. The director of training at SOE, Major Colin Gubbins. We've seen his face before. Churchill had known him through Ireland, etc. And in fact, 3 years later, Gubbins was placed in charge of the entire operation of SOE. He was a very flexible individual, very sharp mind, and he had the overview of SOE's many divisions and country sections. This was such a dangerous time for Britain, as they knew they were alone and next in line for an invasion. Don't forget, Italy had already joined Germany as an ally. So the threat was definitely imminent. It was a worldwide body, but its major efforts were targeted into France and other countries in Europe. This map shows in France where the resistant groups were located. Some of those groups were in the Vichy area, and in fact, others were in the occupied zone of France. France, or F section as it was known, was headed by Maurice Buckmaster in the autumn of 1941. And he recruited male and female officers for work in the field. And there were also other operations in Yugoslavia, Greece, Belgium, Holland, Poland, Norway, Czechoslovakia, Abyssinia, Burma, even Malaya. So this was taking place all over the world. There's the map I mentioned of France. The German occupied zone up here, the north part of France, and down the coast of the Atlantic here. The free zone, as it was called, was Vichy France. There's Vichy there. And in charge was French Marshal Pétain, and he was collaborating with the Nazis. So it wasn't only Germans who were occupying France, but some of these here were Italians that were occupying France. Now, because SOE was a secret organization, you can't put an advertisement in the paper to get people. If you try and advertise, everybody will know. So useful recruits were selected by people you knew and people who had the ability to speak a particular foreign language extremely well without the trace of an accent. Now, many of the agents that were dropped, many were eccentrics, misfits, black sheep. Some of them were even criminals. However, they all wanted the destruction of Nazism. Women were treated exactly the same as men, mainly because women could perform many tasks better than men. They could blend into society. And they were also not seen so much as a threat than a man might be. Also, if a man is walking around in civilian clothes in France, he's going to be stopped. Why aren't you in the military helping? So, therefore, women were recruited in about as much as with men. Britain was much more aware of the importance of women's role in World War II, and this was assisted by the German male attitude to women, which considered women basically as homemakers. Therefore, Germans felt less suspicious of SOE's female agent. They didn't arouse suspicion, and those female agents acting as couriers would slip into the same role without difficulty. Any question? The senior ranks of SOE came mainly from familiar backgrounds of public schools, the business world, the armed services, MPs, and the existing intelligence networks. When I say public schools, let me define a public school in England. It's not a public school in America, as many of you know. Places like Eton, Harrow, Winchester, those are private schools that cost a lot of money to go to and usually educate the upper class. Okay? As long as you're sure. The head of the SOE was known as Chief Director, CD. The first one was Frank Nelson. He was a member of Parliament, a politician. Lord Selborne then followed. He was another MP. And then Sir Charles Hambro, who was a banker. Then, finally, Brigadier now Colin Gubbins got promoted from being the training guy to the man in charge. He was promoted to CD, and of course, he was recognized that women would be vital in carrying out highly confidential and top secret work, including behind enemy lines. And Gubbins was eventually promoted to brigadier in the British Army. Now, in October 1940, the HQ of SOE was moved into 64 Baker Street, as we mentioned, in London, and planning started for ungentlemanly warfare and active resistance against the Nazis. In fact, you can see this plaque outside that particular building. So again, next time you're in London, have a look at it. Throughout the war, thousands of men and women were recruited by SOE as agents, couriers, wireless operators, and also saboteurs to disrupt and incapacitate the enemy. And Churchill ardently supported the SOE. He reveled in the disruption to production and defenses and communications that took place because of these people. Most of the training for the agents were conducted actually in stately homes throughout England. It was a joke within a SOE that SOE stood for Stately Homes of England. Okay. The first of these was Brickendonbury Manor. It was located, and still is, 20 miles outside London in Hertfordshire. Let me get that point. So it's an easy place to find. It was opened in December 1940 and was used as a training centre for spies and for saboteurs. Another of those training locations was called Pollardswood Grange, a property actually my wife and I lived next door to in a small village in Buckinghamshire called Little Chalfont. This property was requisitioned in 1941 and became Special Training School 20 and used to train Polish resistance agents before they were dropped into Poland. Now, SOE's training system was compared to a set of sieves, each one with a closer mesh than the one before. They wanted to screen out people who were not appropriate. The initial posting for an agent during training was really in physical fitness, with plenty of cross-country running. Those who successfully passed the first stage were then sent to the west coast of Scotland, where there were courses in more military training, including the use of weapons and silent killing. Those who successfully completed those courses went to another group of country houses around the New Forest area, including this one, Beaulieu Manor. It's in the New Forest in southern England, and it's another destination for you to consider on your next trip to Britain. It has in it now an SOE exhibit and a wonderful motor museum. Anybody who's into cars will know this place. Here they learned how to fit into the occupied country that they were being sent to and the techniques of sabotage. Now, parachuting was taught at Manchester Airport. It's called Ringway Airport. And the wireless school was just outside Oxford. Any questions? The very first SOE operation took place in November 1940, shortly after the formation of SOE, and it involved the return to power of Haile Selassie, He was the Emperor of Abyssinia. Now, if you remember, Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Abyssinia, had fled his country after Mussolini had invaded in 1935. Abyssinia is now called Ethiopia. And there was a considerable amount of resistance within Abyssinia to the Italians being there. So a group of generals and also Anthony Eden, who was the Minister of War, had a meeting in Khartoum on October the 28th, 1940, and the generals involved included one called Ord Wingate. And after training at SOE establishments, a number of those resistance fighters were successful in pushing out the Italians on May the 5th, 1941, and allowing Haile Selassie back in to Abyssinia. In front here, that's General Ord Wingate on a white horse. Already in the autumn of 1940, there were contacts with rebellious patriots in Poland and Czechoslovakia, and small quantities of arms and explosives were being smuggled into the country. Many groups of resistance fighters wanted to hit back at the Germans, but they needed encouragement and they also needed assistance. So in establishing the SOE, Britain showed the oppressed people of Europe that they were not forgotten and gave proof that even in Britain's darkest hours, they remembered that Britain was fighting not only for its own freedom, but for that of the rest of Europe. Now, within SOE, each country had a section head, and they knew intimately the territory into which the section was to work. They spoke the language fluently, and they were well versed in its history and customs. This is an example of a suitcase radio, initially supplied to resistance groups throughout Europe. Clearly, the first task of SOE was to establish channels of communication between the occupied countries of Europe and the United Kingdom. This meant that agents, instructions, and supplies could be sent to the resistance groups. Certainly, there were many, many heroes in SOE, one of which was Vera Atkins. She was interviewed in February 1941, very early on, and hired immediately as a WWII officer. She had been born in 1908 in Romania, but she spoke flawless French, as well as many other languages. And she came to England in the late 1930s. Her title was Intelligence Officer for F Section, or France. She reported directly to Colin Gubbins, who described her as the most powerful personality in SOE. If any of you have ever watched Foyle's War, anybody ever watched that series? Early on, Foyle is starting to get involved in the intelligence area. And the lady that was shot in the series is Vera. She coordinated the preparation of more than 400 secret agents. 40 of them were women. When Vera was recruited, not one agent had been successfully infiltrated. She made it happen. She was awarded the French Légion d'honneur as a commander in 1995 and a CBE commander of the British Empire in 1997. A truly brave individual. SOE's signal staff came up with this invention, the S phone, in late 42. This was extremely popular with the resistance fighters, and it consisted of a ground transceiver and an air transceiver that allowed SOE agents who were behind enemy lines to communicate with friendly aircraft at night, to coordinate landings and dropping of agents and supplies. There were two possible ways by which men and material could be sent into occupied countries, by sea or by air. Unfortunately, the sea route proved to be very difficult because of the added land movement that you need to use after you get to the coast. And people were trying to do it, but unfortunately they found they were being bought up by the occupying forces. The parachute dropping and container packaging became a minor wartime industry. In fact, by 1944, the failure rate of these drops was considered highly successful. It was like 1 in 100,000 went wrong, which was really magnificent. Although a number of agents were parachuted in to the occupied countries, a more efficient and a safer method was provided by the RAF. And they transported agents and supplies into the occupied territories. And the Royal Air Force's Special Duties Service was again another secret air service formed in August 1940. The bulk of the supplies to the resistance in France were transported by 138 Squadron, while the agent drops were 161. And most of the supplies were dropped in by light bombers like the Sterling and the Whitley bombers. However, the agent transport and pickups were done with the Westland Lysander. This was a little single-engine monoplane built in 1938 and was aerodynamically advanced. It was so good at flying slowly and landing in very tight areas like fields. It had a stalling speed of 65 miles an hour. This enabled it to land and take off in very short distances, and the turnaround time for these trips was no more than 3 minutes, and there was room for 3 passengers. Any questions? A cousin of a very good friend of mine was one of those secret pilots, Peter Vaughan Fowler. Peter flew Lysanders. He joined the RAF at 18 and he became a special duties pilot, flying agents into France and picking up aircrew who had been shot down. He also delivered and picked up agents from France. He flew 27 missions, survived the war, married, had 8 children, and retired from the RAF in 1975. He, along with other special duties pilots, was based here at RAF Tempsford. It's near Bedford in England, a secret airfield used by SOE agents. And it remained a highly secret RAF station during the rest of World War II. The Special Duties Group who flew Lysanders flew a total of about 500 agents into occupied countries and brought back about 600 either agents or downed aircrew. The flights were always at night, but it was essential to have a full moon. During the flight, the pilot would hold the folding map in one hand and the stick control in the other. On leaving England, the pilot would drop down to 500 feet across the channel to get under the German radar. Once they approached the coast, they climbed right up to 8,000 feet to get above the flag. Once they crossed the coast, they came down again to within 1 to 2,000 feet, so they could identify the landmarks in the moonlight. Vaughan Fowler, by the way, is this gentleman here. When the agent got close to the landing area, the field agent would signal a prearranged code letter in Morse code, and the pilot would reply back in Morse code to confirm, and if successful, the operator on the ground would light 3 lights so that they could see where to land. Once landed, the pilot would keep the engine running, drop off the agent, take back agents or aircrew who needed to leave in a hurry, and within 3 minutes, they'd take off and return. Can you imagine doing those flights? As mentioned earlier, the RAF conducted parachute drops of supplies to the resistance fighters using Whitley, Sterling, and Hudson bombers. Now, once America entered the war, a special unit designated the 801st, consisting of B-24 Liberators of the United States Air Force, was used. They were popularly known as the Carpetbaggers, and that was after their first mission codename. They were based initially out of RAF Tempsford, the secret airbase. And in January 44, they learned from SOE, who were trained in clandestine supply operations. Once fully trained, the 801st was moved to Harrington up here, where it grew to 64 Liberator bombers based there. The SOE packing station was Station 61, quite close by. Again, close by. The recommendation was the US packing station, OSS, should be as close so the two organizations, SOE and OSS, could use the same packed material. Thus, the majority of staff was actually moved out here to Area H in the village of Holme near Cambridge. Coordination between the OSS and the SOE was constant, and packing procedures mirrored each other. The delivery of supplies to occupied Europe started with specially developed packing containers, which protected the contents during a parachute drop. A standard packing on this load was 5 Sten guns with 15 magazines, 1,500 rounds of 9mm ammunition, 5 pistols with 250 rounds of ammunition, 52 grenades, and 18 pounds of explosives. The weight of the full container, about 300 pounds. Once packed, the containers were taken by convoy to the waiting air. The carpetbaggers learned from the SOE pilots by performing low-level nighttime sorties whenever there was a full moon. You needed that moon. They stayed below 2,000 feet. I mean, an airplane of that size at 2,000 feet, it won't be long before if you fly over the channel, you'll get the waves hitting the bottom. Once over the target, they used the S-phones to communicate with the resistance team on the ground. And they went down as low as 500 feet, which lessened the chance of damage to the container. The end of the war in Europe brought about the 804, the 801. They had dropped 550 agents by parachute and 4,500 tons of supplies. Unfortunately, the loss of aircrew was about 220. That was awful. The scope of their operations included France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Italy, Poland, Norway. They were brave men. Well, that brings us to the end of this first session. The next session, we're going to look at some of the SOE operations that had an effect on the outcome of World War II. Any questions? Yes, love.
Like that the American government was aware of the SOE, was Churchill in communication with the government?
Yes, he shared that with Roosevelt. Not immediately. It took a little while to share it, but not more than 6 months.
Is it true that their British invention of radar really helped in the Battle of Britain?
Very much. In fact, it was the key point. Radar. Well, what's interesting with radar is that it was developed both in Germany and in Britain and many other countries. But Germany, because of Mr. Hitler, saw it as an offensive weapon, whereas Britain saw it as a defensive weapon. And that helped enormously in Britain during the Battle of Britain, because the radar effectiveness extended over the north of France. So it was possible for Britain to see the air raids beginning to form over France before they came over, 20 minutes ahead of time. And they were therefore prepared for that. And then with the observer corps, who were all along the coast, they would identify the planes, the quantity of them, and the direction, and send that to the RAF organization just outside London, and they were able to disperse the Spitfires and the Hurricanes to attack. So you're absolutely right. That was so important. And it probably, along with the Spitfire, were the two most important inventions of World War II for the British. Any other question? Well,